Normally, you'd like to think that Kentucky versus Louisville is pretty competitive, but I don't really know if that's going to be the case this Thursday.
You are Locked On Kentucky, your daily podcast on the Kentucky Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's going on, Big Blue Nation? Welcome on into Locked On Kentucky, your daily Kentucky Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Lance Dawe, writer for Sports Illustrated for various SEC-related things. But on this podcast, we take a dive into all things Kentucky athletics. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can make every moment more, and right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. You can visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Kentucky, we are going to be previewing Kentucky versus Louisville happening tomorrow. Normally, you'd like to think that this game is pretty competitive, but this is not going to be the case. At least I don't think. Thank you so much for making Locked On Kentucky your first listen every single day. I want to remind everyone out there that we are free and available on all platforms. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the show. If you're listening on podcast, please subscribe to whatever feed you are tuning in from. I would greatly appreciate it. So let's go ahead and get into it. The Louisville Cardinals, underneath Kenny Payne, longtime Kentucky assistant, the Cardinals are bad. There is no other way to put it. This is simply not a good team. What I want to do today is I want to talk about the things that Louisville does not do well. I want to talk about what they do actually do well on the court, and there's not a lot of things they do well. And then I want to explain how Kentucky is going to attack this. Spoiler alert, I don't think that they are going to have to get really out of their element at all for this contest, and I really do hope I'm not about to eat my words and somehow Louisville pulls this thing off tomorrow. I really do hope that does not happen, because all statistics and all of the eye test watching that you could do, all the film breakdown you could do, everything points to Kentucky being the better team, matching up well with the Cardinals, and then being predicted to go and win this game pretty handily. So what do the Cardinals do poorly? For starters, they are a bad three-point shooting team. As of right now, and this recording is December 20th, 2023, the Louisville Cardinals are shooting 29.4% from beyond the arc. That is awful, first and foremost, but that is 306th nationally out of 363 teams. Louisville won a national title 11 years ago. I believe it was 9 years ago, excuse me. Let that sink in for a second. The way that this team has fallen from grace. Their top shooters, if you look at their top three scores, they are shooting 27.3, 25.8, and 34.3% from beyond the arc. Their best three-point shooter is Curtis Williams, who averages 4 points a game and 12 and a half minutes per contest. Essentially not much of a factor for the Cardinals. He's also only shooting 38.3% from the floor, which we will get to in literally just a second. But holy cow, this team cannot shoot the rock. They also cannot shoot from inside the arc, and they are arguably worse inside the arc whenever they are shooting from two, whether that be mid-range shots or whether it be layups. According to Ken Payne, and brace yourself, the Cardinals are shooting 47.3% from inside the arc. That's 263rd nationally. That is a better mark nationally than the three-point percentage, but I would argue that it's almost more embarrassing that they are so low inside the arc, because most teams early in the season have the opportunity to go on cold stretches and then heat up as the season goes along. Louisville, not so much here. They just simply can't hit at all. They have gone cold from every aspect of the floor, minus the foul line, which we will get to later on in the show. It's actually funny. Last year, Louisville averaged 47.3% from inside the arc, as they are this season. So the Cardinals right now, they can't shoot from outside the arc. They can't shoot from inside the arc offensively, and they don't distribute the basketball. Again, go back to KenPom. You can look at the assist numbers just basically on basic statistics on ESPN, CBS, whatever you want to do. 10.7 assists per contest, so a little under 11 assists per contest. This offense does not simply, they move, but they don't really do anything with the basketball. They average more turnovers than they do assists, 12.6 to 10.7, and their assists per field goals made, which is an advanced statistic on KenPom, which essentially is what percentage of baskets are assisted on for you. And that number is 42.6%. That is 316th nationally. So we're going over these pretty basic to slightly advanced numbers here, breaking down they can't shoot closer to the rim, and then they also don't distribute the basketball well. They have a decent pace, which we will break down in the positive section. But this Louisville offense doesn't really do a whole lot of anything. And then you look at the defense, and it's just as confusing. Their adjusted efficiency is 174th nationally. That's slightly underneath average. I would argue that that's embarrassing considering the fact that they've played some really bad opponents. UMBC, they lost to Chattanooga, they lost to DePaul, they lost to Arkansas State, they played Bellarmine, they played New Mexico State, they played Pepperdine, and they've just not really looked particularly impressive against the majority of that slate, minus Coppin State. Didn't mean to rhyme there. I have an interesting stat here for you about the Louisville defense. So I mentioned a second ago that the adjusted tempo for this team is pretty solid. They move the games at a pretty decent pace, even though the Cards do like to get to the foul line quite a bit. Louisville, against teams ranked 175th or higher in adjusted tempo. I've set the bar pretty low here to make a point. 175th or higher in adjusted tempo. Those opponents against Louisville so far this season have averaged over 77 points a game, which is a lot. Louisville against teams 175th or lower in adjusted tempo, so teams slower than 175th nationally, only average a little under 71 points per game, 70.7 to be exact. So the Cards, one way or another, are giving up a decent amount of points, but they really struggle against fast-paced teams. Kentucky right now, I'll pull this up for you briefly, is currently 23rd in the country in adjusted tempo. UMBC, by the way, the first opponent of the season for the Cards, is second in the country in adjusted tempo, and the Golden Retrievers scored 93 points against Louisville. If you can see where I'm going with this, it's pretty basic. The matchup does not bode well for Louisville. They don't shoot well. They don't protect the rim well. They run at a decent pace, but opponents thrive in that. So what do the Cards do well? What are some things that we can point to and say, okay, that's something that Louisville may be able to take advantage of in this contest? We'll look at some individual play. We'll talk about some positives in just a second. Before I do that, though, I want to tell you guys about our friends over at FanDuel. Because right now, new customers over at FanDuel get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. And as the weather gets colder here, the NFL offers are staying hot on FanDuel. So many different things to do on their app that is super easy to use. Wide range of betting options from spreads to player props to over-unders and more on top of that. So you need to visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off your NFL season with FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. All right, continuing along here on the Wednesday edition of Locked On Kentucky. Lance Dawe hanging out here with you. I really appreciate you tuning into Locked On Kentucky. Again, if you have not subscribed to the show, this is the place for all of your Kentucky basketball content, from recruiting to breakdowns of games to recaps to discussing individual players. If you've got any questions for the show, also, you can absolutely leave them in the YouTube comments below. And if you want to hit me on the socials, at LockedOnUK is where you can find me. If you want to tag me on a tweet, send me a message. I will do my best to answer the question on the show. So we talked about what Louisville does poorly They don't shoot well. They don't distribute the basketball. They don't run well defensively. What do the Cards do well? For starters, and this is probably the only strength, quote unquote, of this team, is that they do get to the foul line, and they rely on the foul line pretty heavily. According to KenPom, again, my favorite place to go, they are 12th nationally in point distribution from the foul line. What does point distribution mean? It simply means your percentage of points that you get from 3, from 2, and from the free throw line. So if I average 100 points per game and I get 25% of my points from the foul line, that means per game I get 25 points from the free throw line. That's a pretty high rate, all things considered. And the Cardinals are getting their points 25.2% of the time from knocking down free throws. This is in stark contrast to Kentucky, who relies on the free throw line significantly less, about 10% less, actually. Kentucky gets most of their points from 2, which most teams in the country do, but they have a heavy reliance on the outside shot, according to their point distribution. So I think it's really interesting the way that Louisville has elected to kind of play their offense this season, and they kind of have to, because of their poor shooting numbers, rely on the charity stripe to get some of these points. In fact, and if you go and look at some of their bigger games where they have been slightly more competitive, they have been able to get to the foul line. I want to point here to Texas, a game that I watched almost the entirety of earlier this season. This was November 19th, so right at a month ago. Louisville got to the foul line 31 times, as opposed to Texas's 23. And Louisville knocked down 27 of their 31 free throws, good for 87%. I think that could be an area that keeps Louisville in this game. They have proven they can get to the foul line, and they've also proven they can knock shots down there at a pretty decent rate. In fact, they're top 90 in the country in free throw percentage, shooting just a little bit under 74% from the foul line there. So Louisville has the ability to hurt Kentucky in that aspect, but they actually have to be able to draw those fouls, and I'm curious to see how Louisville's guards elect to attack these Kentucky big men. And Ugonna Onyenso, Aaron Bradshaw, Trey Mitchell. The Cardinals here have 3 guards that kind of lead them. Sky Clark, former Kentucky commit, high 4-star prospect, shooting 27% from 3 and only 38% from the floor. He also averages 3 turnovers per game, but he's averaging 15 points per contest as well. He's their leading scorer by a pretty okay margin. Their second best scorer is Trey White at 12.8 points. He is also another guard for them. He leads the team in steals as well. And then Mike James is the third guard here that averages 12.4 points per contest. He is 6'5", and then Trey White is listed at 6'7", technically as a guard, and then Sky Clark at 6'3". They have some height in their backcourt, but again, I think the inefficiency shooting is going to end up being a problem in this contest because Kentucky's got some guards that can light it up and are okay defensively, and I think can pretty much hold their own outside of maybe Louisville getting to the foul line a decent amount. So Louisville gets to the foul line. They play with solid pace. Like I mentioned earlier, they're top 110 in the country in adjusted tempo. And then even good three-point shooting teams have struggled against the Cardinals. That's also, if you want to talk about strengths, free throws, great. Three-point defense has been the other quote-unquote strength for Louisville. They currently hold opponents to shooting underneath 29% from beyond the arc. I will say this, though. They have not faced off against a ton of teams that are really good at shooting threes. They've also not faced off against a ton of teams that rely on the three-point shot as heavily as Kentucky does. So here's an interesting statistic here for you. Louisville's top 3 opponents in three-point percentage when it combined 16 of 60 against the Cardinals in those 3 games. That's 26.6%. That's not good. But it's also worth noting that these 3 teams, DePaul, Pepperdine, and Texas, are not even close to the top 150 of point distribution percentage from 3. And as we discussed earlier, what is point distribution? Point distribution is just simply the percentage of points that you get from 3, from 2, and from the foul line. For those of you that have heard me explain that like 7 or 8 times over the past month, I apologize. There are consistently new listeners that I would love to break down some of the numbers here, and it's not complicated. But 3-point percentage is something to monitor in this contest. But at the same time, Louisville hasn't faced off against a ton of opponents, and they surely haven't faced off against a team like Kentucky that has the guard depth that the Wildcats do, with that ability to also knock down the 3-point shot consistently. Kentucky, I don't know if they're going to take a ton of threes in this game, but they'll have the opportunity to. And even if they don't hit a high percentage, even if they do fall victim to what other Louisville opponents have, I still think Kentucky's probably going to be able to hit enough, or they're going to be able to drive to the rim and they're going to be able to score there somewhat consistently. So Louisville, we talked about the strengths. We talked about the weaknesses earlier. How does Kentucky attack this? How does Kentucky deal with the Cardinals? I want to break that down in just a moment. Before I do that, though, I want to tell you guys about our friends over at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to have as many top-tier candidates as possible to interview. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. It's not just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of over 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place simply to hire. And hiring is easy when you have all of those quality candidates. It's so easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours of posting a job. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many different hats, they might not have the time or resources to hire, but thankfully with LinkedIn, the process is intuitive, quick, and easy. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, wrapping up the Wednesday edition of Locked On Kentucky. Again, if you guys have any questions for the show, if you've got any thoughts on this contest or anything else going on with Kentucky basketball, you can absolutely leave that in the YouTube comments below or hit me on the socials at Locked On UK on Twitter. So we've talked about the good, the bad, and now let's face our attention to the Wildcats, who come into this game off of a big-time win against North Carolina in the CBS Sports Classic. I've discussed previously on the 2 most recent episodes how Kentucky has the ability to kind of build some momentum here. They have the chance to really stand out and win their next few games. Louisville, Illinois State, on the road at Florida, at home against Missouri, and then on the road at Texas A&M. 2 of those games going to prove to be very difficult on the road with the Gators and the Aggies, but I still think that it's possible for Kentucky to win those games. It's very possible. It's just going to be very difficult. So Kentucky has the chance, starting here after this UNC game, to build some momentum. What I want to see out of Kentucky and the way that they attack Louisville is to not revert back to what we saw against UNC Wilmington just 3 games ago. You have to be able to maintain focus on the offensive end of the floor. Kentucky does a really good job of distributing the basketball and scoring off of assists. But at times, you watch this offense go, and I think they put too much of an emphasis whenever they are falling apart on the offensive end of the floor, which hasn't happened a ton this season. They put too much of an emphasis on randomly choosing which players to score in isolation, and sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense. And sometimes it leads to losses like the UNC Wilmington game, where you just simply don't have any direction, and you're trying to... Hero ball is not the right word because that's not what Kentucky's offense is, not even in the slightest. But it feels like at times it's just like, okay, now you go. Okay, now you go. Okay, now you try and figure out how to make this thing go. And it leads to scoring droughts and inconsistency and just weird pacing that allows opponents to either build leads or get back into a game. So I want to see Kentucky focus on the offensive end of the floor, even when shots aren't falling, because sometimes Kentucky is organized and shots just don't fall. Focus, control the game, and don't sleepwalk through the first half. It's going to be very important because this environment, I hope I'm not eating my words here, it's probably not going to be nearly as serious as maybe you saw against Kansas or you saw against Penn in that semi-away contest, despite those games being at neutral sites. And the environment is probably not going to take Kentucky out of this game. You're not going to see a legitimate home environment until you play Florida or until you play Texas A&M. Kentucky's got to be able to step in here, control it, and then walk out with a win. But how do they attack this individually? I think Kentucky has the chance to control this at the rim. And I know that statistically, we saw some things talking about three-point shooting that may be of interest to UK and the pacing therefore. But I think guys like Aaron Bradshaw, I think guys like DJ Wagner are going to have chances at the rim to finish and do so consistently. Will Wagner have a consistent offensive game? Will Justin Edwards have a consistent offensive game? You can look to moments like this and say, okay, here's another chance. I think that despite Louisville's height that they've got at the wing and at the guard spot, Kentucky's guards and then a couple of their big men can take advantage of Louisville's deficiencies on both ends of the floor, but particularly on the defensive end, not being able to guard the rim. You could see Kentucky get out and run, maybe look for those three-point shots, but also look to draw fouls and look to score at the basket fast. So I think that that's where Kentucky attacks offensively. Defensively, I think Kentucky's got to focus, really, really focus on staying in front of that rim and not fouling a ton. Make sure that guys like Trey Mitchell and Hugo, when he gets out there, don't foul a ton. You have to try and play solid defense. Go up with the shooter. Don't make extreme contact. Don't swat at the ball whenever you don't have an opportunity to do so. Just control what you can control on both ends. And I think if Kentucky does that, they will be able to get out of here with a pretty solid win. So if you've got any thoughts on the matchup against the Cardinals, you can leave that in the YouTube comments below or hit me on the socials. I think that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Kentucky. You can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On UK. You can follow me on Twitter at @LanceDawe_, and you can follow the show over on Instagram. That is at Kentucky Podcast. Any questions, comments, concerns, leave those in the YouTube comments below. Hit me on the socials. I will see you all tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Kentucky. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and God bless.